as we get started, I just wondered if you could maybe tell us a little bit about your background, kind of what you're doing, and then how you got into it, and then why you decided to start Rising Phoenix.
Sure. So I was born up in Jersey, grew up here in Atlanta in the dirty South. And at the ripe old age of 11, I was the oldest of three kids. And at the time, my dad was working out of town. He spent about 10 years working out of town. So he was home on weekends. And being the oldest of three kids and having no other family in town, I usually had to start helping out, which started out helping my mom in the kitchen. And so my whole journey, usually the way that I tell the story for me, started in the kitchen. And personally, I'd say a lot of it ties back to both a cooking mentality, but also just the mentality of putting things together that are good for your health. I mean, that's kind of the gist of my whole story. And when I was a kid, I wanted to be two things. I either wanted to be an archaeologist or I wanted to be a spice trader. I don't know what kid comes up with that stuff, but I did. And years
Yeah.
later, I ended up going to medical school for Chinese medicine. And
Okay.
while I was in school, started Rising Phoenix, and the way that that came about, and this ties back in with me being an archaeologist and a spice trader. I'll get to that in a second.
Sure.
But while I was in school, we, on top of learning medicine and everything, you essentially get a pharmacy compounding education. And so we're having to learn hundreds and hundreds of medical substances and how to put these things together. And when I was a kid, my dad worked for Johnson and Johnson. My grandfather worked in the confectionery industry. He worked for Mars
Okay.
Candy and Hershey's, and he did a whole bunch of stuff. And it kind of started to dawn on me at the end of my second year in school, beginning of my third, that pretty much everything I was learning was what everything in the world is made from: pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, cosmetics, flavor, fragrance. And so I was like, okay, with that realization, I could be a doctor or I could be a doctor and I wanted to explore
Mm.
the question was how to explore the and. I didn't think I wanted to start some kind of like food manufacturing company. It's like, how do you, what am I going to do? Start a pharmaceutical company? And
Right.
strangely enough, the easiest place to start dabbling was fragrance and working with essential
Hmm.
oils and then also incense. And so the first place I started actually was with incense. And I'm learning
Uh,
like tanxiang, chenxiang, which are sandalwood and agarwood. I wanted to get my hands on the best stuff I could, and I couldn't. The supply that we used, it just wasn't good. And so I had to set out to find
yeah.
how to connect with the materials. And I was like, gosh, all of these things that I'm learning are pretty much used both in medicine and also in incense. And so I started trying to resource things on my own, trying to make things. And that's when it kind of dawned on me that, oh, all of these materials that are used for incense, you can distill and produce oils. And you have to go back, 15 years at this point or so. And the essential
Hmm.
oil supply chain was not as good as it was today. So again, the question, how do I
Right.
get my hands on the oils, which led me to start finding artisans and then commissioning batches of things, which ultimately led down the road to me buying equipment and starting a couple distillation operations. And so all of these things were kind of tied together. And this brings me back to being a spice trader, working with all of these things. And I
Hmm.
was like, gosh, somehow I became a spice trader. And the archaeology part of it is that when I'm working on patients, you're always kind of like digging down, dusting off, pulling out pieces, trying to like, oh, okay, I've got these 15 pieces. And it's not until you dig them all out that you're like, oh, that's one thing. That's one disease pattern. That's one. And so in a roundabout way, I kind of felt like I became both an archaeologist and a spice trader. And started the school there in my junior year of medical school, my third year of medical school, I should say. And
Hmm.
here we are. That would have been back in 2011. This is 2023, the time we're recording. So 12 years into the journey
Right.
and insanity of running Rising Phoenix.
Yeah, that's a pretty wild, like kind of chain of events. If I think about, your family history with Johnson and Johnson and Mars, or what was
Like Mars
the other?
and Hershey's and
Yeah, and then it's like it can all kind of weave
yeah,
together. But I think at least for me personally, that was this is something that really interested me about like Chinese medicine and herbalism and tea and incense is like there's so much kind of
Hmm.
crossover where it's like if you start to get a foundation and some familiarity and a good understanding, it kind of bleeds over a little bit into the other things and kind of you can put your foot in the door and be like, okay, I'm not starting from square one with this. I can kind of get around with, I can kind of, understand this. At least for me, that's how it worked. I started with like just making herbal teas and stuff, and then making my own weird food recipes and whatever. And then it got into like teas, and then it's like, oh, I got to find the best tea. Then I learned about all the different types of tea. Then it's like that's a whole thing. And then a friend of mine turned me on to agarwood. And he was like, dude, are you into incense? And I was kind of like, no, incense is gross because I was thinking like Nag Champa and
Yeah.
sage. Yeah, because I always thought like people burn sage and Palo Santo, so I just thought those both smelled like cat piss most of the time. That was the association in my head was like dirty hippies, smelly armpits, patchouli, those things. So I was like, no, dude, incense is disgusting. And then he was like, well, hold on, and he pulled out the agarwood, and I was like, whoa. And then that was probably 2017 or 18 or something. It's just been a whole.
Work in tea, and they think that you're pulling out like bagged teas.
What's
That it's
that?
almost like saying, "Oh yeah, I work in tea," and then you pull out bagged
Oh,
teas, and you're like, "No, no, 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 no. We're not talking about Lipton here. Like it's much bigger than that."
yeah, exactly. I think that's what I hope we can kind of unpack some of these deeper elements throughout this conversation because I think for a lot of people, their association with fragrance or perfume or essential oil is, oh, I went to Macy's and I smelled whatever that is, or I got like a scented
Right.
candle. And it's like, no, there's so much more to it than that.
Actually, that's a good segue. Can I make a tell a little bit of a story here that'll tie all that together?
Absolutely.
So, I usually tell people that my forte is, and where I kind of feel like I myself operate at my best is at the point of intersection of the perfume, medicine, and incense trade. And when I'm explaining to people what I do, I usually tell people, first off, it's not what it sounds like. And I tell people I sell Ferraris, and people are like, what? And I was like, I essentially work in high value natural aromatics. And then I circle back to this point of intersection of the perfume, medicine, and incense trade. And I think there's a lot of context. In today's day and age, there's a lot of talk of colonialism, but I think it's missing a lot of the context of, aside from like money, like the how and why it all happened. And part of my perspective on that is, why do we as Americans exist? Like, why did Columbus set sail? And really, for the
Sure.
perfume, medicine, and incense trade. Usually, when I ask this question, people have no idea. Maybe
Right.
maybe you'll get a rare person that says, "Oh, for shorter routes to India," but I never get a cohesive or comprehensive answer. And then when we start
Right.
talking about the perfume, medicine, and incense trade, you have to start thinking back to a time where, like even here in the America, basic things like Tolu balsam, Peru balsam, sassafras, vanilla, chocolate. It's like 5 centuries ago, none of this stuff existed, essentially. And how
Right.
revolutionary it was to the world when these things started coming out. I mean, even something as basic as Irish potatoes and tomatoes, like Italian tomato sauce, those things would not have existed if nobody had come to the Americas. Corn here in the Americas definitely, it's like corn is grown all over the world, but like none of this stuff existed. And so you have to start
Right.
thinking just how big and revolutionary connecting all of these points. And we also live in a day and age where you can hop online, click a button, something is shipped to you from around the world, and you can get it a couple days later. And it's like
Yep.
this stuff would take a year or two in transit sometimes to get some place.
Yeah.
And the amount of manpower and connectivity, and so you can start thinking in terms of like a global network. And there's at least nearly 10,000 years of written history of global trade.
Yeah.
But really, the last 5 centuries is when the world as we know it, I would kind of peg it as starting to come into existence as people started to bring things in and trying to streamline, moving things around. Uh, whether we say that the way that it was gone about was good or bad, I think is.
Right.
But
Right.
this is why these things started happening. And to this, I'll also mention you have. So I went to medical school out in San Diego, and
Okay.
the school I went to was in Mission Valley, and I remember going up to the mission of Mission Valley, which was like the church that used to oversee the Catholic Church that used to oversee the whole area. And there are these plaques
Yep.
that they had, and it's really funny because I had friends with me the first time I saw this, and I had everybody read it after I read it, and none of them made the connection. And when I explained it, everybody was like, "Oh," and I'm like, "Literally, it's telling you exactly what happened," and nobody got it. So when they first put that in, Catholic Church comes in and they start talking with the locals, and they essentially enlist people to start growing stuff on farms. And so the Catholic
Mm.
Church wasn't just about, spreading the good word, like the message of God. A lot of these
Right.
also involved in perfume, medicine, and incense trade. And so they started
Yep.
putting in citrus trees, which at the time were rarities because they had only started entering the European market, not too long before. And really they were kind of spreading on the southern end of the Mediterranean, and then also through North Africa. And so, okay, they're growing again. Your years of by ship
Yep.
traveling there. So what are they doing?
Yep.
Growing citrus trees and all of this like really aromatic stuff that's not going to carry on a ship. And
Right.
I was like filling in the blank, connecting the dots. Oh my God, citrus trees. They're distilling the flowers, leaves, twigs. They're making neroli. They're making petitgrain and all sorts of other stuff. And then also on the West Coast, the Catholic Church was trading with China and Asia. And so you
Yeah.
had materials that were being distilled to produce stuff in fragrance, which also went into medicine. But then also they were taking all the citrus, like the fruit, and then they were making, and the peels as well. They were making like marmalades and other stuff that went into. Did we freeze there?
For some reason you
Did we
froze.
freeze there? Are we
Are you
back?
back? I think
Okay.
so. I think you're back now.
Okay. So I was saying they're distilling all of these oils they're distilling the oils,
Hmm.
but then they're also making essentially what we would call marmalades and things like this that go into food, but also medicine. And then also citrus peels are used not only in cuisine, but also in medicine as well. And
Yep.
then also like fragrance and cosmetics and stuff like this. So you have to start looking as these networks that were going out around the world was also a way of producing materials that went into global trade. It wasn't just about money. Like everybody likes to think about money and power, and I think it was much bigger than that, and not necessarily as ominous sounding as money and power. I think a large part of this was also uh, creating work and productivity for people around the world, and then also creating a network to bring these things together. And so, if you look at, especially the last 5 centuries, I think a lot
Yep.
of this ties into how the world has, the world that we live in today. We don't think about these things. Black pepper is cheap.
Right.
I can go to the store and buy vanilla. It's like everybody, even when I was growing up, and I'm in my 40s, I couldn't get
Yep.
citrus outside of a couple weeks in winter. So
Mm.
even in the last 20 or 30 years, I think a lot of this has been changing with the accessibility to things. But this was just creating that global network, and then working in Chinese medicine is what kind of opened the door for me to see how all of these things were connected. And the irony being that I grew up under two men who were kind of involved in a roundabout way in this connectivity. And so
Yep.
once that connection clicked, I was like, all the work that my dad and my grandfather were doing, I was like, oh, okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I think well, you mentioned a lot of good points. I just like two things that come to mind for me. First is like how we take all this stuff for granted, even stuff like coffee, tea, sugar, spices, whatever. Like we take all that stuff for granted because it's such a commodity,
Right.
right? But then if we get over to things like really high grade sandalwood, Kiara, Keenom, these things that are like ultra, ultra, ultra rare and like kind of exist in these secret societies and people are like really protecting them. I think a lot of Westerners and modern people, that's like those paradigms clash heavily because they're like, well, I'm a modern person and I have money, so I should be able to buy and access. And it's like, well, historically speaking, absolutely not. So that's something we'll come back to in a second. But what you were talking about reminds me of when I had a phase where I was really into chocolate. So I got into, the raw cacao, the actual nut that it's all made from. And I like went down that whole rabbit hole, learned all the history, learned all the way it was just spread out through the world. And then when I got into tea, I was learning a very similar thing, like how much these substances massively influenced world history, right? And tea is a great example because there was a point in time where the British Empire was about to go bankrupt and completely fold because they were in so much debt to
For
China from tea.
because
Exactly.
China would
So
only accept gold and silver, and this leads into the Opium Wars in 1840 to 42 that nobody seems to connect the dots with either.
exactly. That's exactly where I was going with it because that was how they figured like, okay, well, we'll just do all this stuff with India and opium and set off a whole other chain of events. Why? Because of tea, because of their tea debt. Not to mention all the crazy stuff they were doing to try and smuggle tea outside of China because that they had a complete like monopoly
Yeah.
on it at that
Well,
time.
and I argue that the colonization of the subcontinent started out for different reasons, but I think the need
Mm,
for tea supply played into part of colonization of India and Sri Lanka,
yep.
and I guess in Bangladesh too, but really in India and Sri Lanka. And so, yeah, I mean the connectivity of how all of these things put together, and I think again, it's not to say it's not to try and take away any of the bad things that happened, but
Of
I do think
course.
a lot of the how and why these things happened was not as nefarious as we like to make them sound. In some ways, it was
Right. Right.
necessity. Unfortunately, it was at the expense of one person for another. But there are reasons why these things happened. It wasn't just you have something, I want it. I don't
Right.
think it was quite the math on it was quite that simple.
Yeah, I think what we're circling around is trying to point out the power and the reverence and the importance of these aromatic substances for medicine, for food, for incense.
Well,
So that kind of we can we can kind of circle back to what I was saying earlier about the inaccessibility of like the really rare
right.
stuff, Quinam, Chiara, super high grade, and how that really clashes with kind of our modern consumer mindset.
Well, can I give you two more funny examples how this ties in with tea? So
Absolutely.
again, here we are as Americans talking, and we have the Boston Tea Party, and everybody just
Yeah.
kind of like shrugs it off. Okay, a 1% tax on tea, like big frickin' whoop. But back in the 1770s, what did a kilo of tea cost?
No idea.
It's my understanding it was somewhere between $5,000 and $7,000 a kilo.
Oh my
Okay,
God.
so 1% tax is a
Yeah.
pretty darn large number, and so it was already a luxury good that people were spending money on,
Right.
and that 1% was actually a huge amount of money. And also,
Yeah.
when you talk about the Boston Tea Party, and it's like, okay, they dumped a bunch of like casks into the ocean. I've
Hmm.
seen estimates. It's really funny. Estimates usually by people who don't know what they're talking about that calculate it to be in the millions. And then I've seen estimates from people who know better of what they're talking about, and it's in the billions of dollars of tea that was dumped into the Boston Harbor. And so when
Yep.
you start thinking about, it's like you can buy a kilo of tea today for like $20. Even
Yeah.
really
If
good
that.
expensive tea is like 1,000, maybe $2,000. It's a fraction
Yeah.
of what it was back then.
Yep.
And so the commodization of these things has really brought the price down, but it helps you understand just how important these kinds of things are. So the second part of that is with the East India Trade Company, we think of spiced chai, so milk and spices and tea as kind of being ubiquitous as like something that's drunk in India. Do
Right.
you know how that came about? So
Nope.
it's my understanding all the loose leaf tea, the whole leaves were being sent in, over into the UK or around the British Empire. What do you do with the tea
Yeah.
dust?
Give it to the peasants, I guess.
Well, again, I think it served, I think more of a. I think it was more of like on the. I'm knocking stuff over as I'm sitting here. I don't know if you can hear it.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, what do you do with a bunch
Right.
of waste product? And on the other hand, there's a big malnutrition issue. So
Ah,
mixing spices with milk and tea was a way of nourishing local people. The way
ah,
that the story is usually told is, oh yeah, this way people could work in the fields longer. I think
sure.
that's a negativity. It's more of like, how do we keep these people from falling apart, and how do we nourish folks? And
Yeah.
it's like you can turn a loss into a gain, and you can take care of people.
Hmm.
That's why I said history these days. We always put so much negativity into it, and I think that
Right.
things are actually more humanitarian and positive than we like to make it sound. And so even something like Indian, like Indian chai or spiced tea, however you want to call it, came about because
Mm.
of the tea trade and exporting tea to the West.
Ah, I see. That it reminds me of, so you're talking about the Boston Tea Party. I remember maybe it was in a ginseng book that I read that they were saying if it had like been had occurred a day before or a day after, it would have been ginseng that went into the harbor and not tea, because American ginseng was also one of the major exports.
Massive.
Because it's like,
It was
because
top,
like in America
top
we don't care about it.
U.S.
What's
It was
that?
one of the top 5 exports out of the U.S. to the Chinese market, but it also went to Europe,
Exactly.
but primarily to the Chinese market.
Exactly.
Wow, could you imagine if it was the Boston Ginseng Party?
I mean, cult history might have been very different.
Yeah,
Um, just based on that one small detail, but it's still like, I mean, I guess even at that point we didn't appreciate it, we didn't value it, and we just shipped 98% of it overseas, and that's still pretty much what we're doing.
yeah.
Just taking everything we find, and to us it's just, oh, here's this root and it's this old, end of story, but we send it to, China, Japan, Korea, whatever, and they've got hundreds of different ways of categorizing and breaking it down and judging quality and judging properties and all these different things. And we're just like, yeah, it's fine. So, I mean,
There, it reminds me of an expression about agarwood that a lot of places in Southeast Asia have. In
yeah,
your country, it's gold. In my country, it's firewood.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
like a lot of things in the country of origin, it may have little or no value, but it'll be highly prized in a
yeah.
place that doesn't have access to it.
Yeah, I've heard where that's part of the reason why these companies in Japan have like massive storehouses and stockhouses of Kiara,
Yeah.
because at a certain point in history, Vietnam just they were like, "Oh, you want this? Okay, sure, you can have it. It's just firewood for us." And the Japanese were like, "Yes, we will take
In
it."
the Kiara today, can run you $1 million plus a kilo. In the '90s, it was $20,000.
Oh my God.
So it's funny you mentioned the Japanese houses. Do you know how all of your old Japanese houses got started? The old like
No.
houses, they all started as pharmacies, Campo pharmacies. So they're
Ah, that makes
medicine
sense.
pharmacies, and making incense in the East, in Asia, China, Korea. Making incense was a form of fumigation therapy. So in the past, it was medicine, which is why these medicine houses got started. Well, how the incense came out of the medicine, the pharmacies, and then it's kind of funny over here. We tend to appreciate scent as either something reverent, so it's associated with religion. Usually over in the West, it's like with the Catholic Church that we kind of associate it
Hmm.
with. But these days, it's something that we do for pleasure. You go into a place like Japan, and incense either smells like a temple or like death. And so incense is usually burned at funerals.
Right.
And
Okay, I
so a
see.
lot of Asian people will say, I don't like incense because they may not be religious, so it
Ah,
reminds them of a temple, or it reminds them of a funeral.
that
So
makes
even
sense.
even today, I think there's a resurgence of just smelling things for pleasure that had existed in the past, but I think in more recent history was not necessarily as widespread as it is today.
So what would be some of the reasons why people would use incense as medicine? Because I think for most people that is like a kind of a weird foreign concept. It's like, well, medicine is something you would have to eat. Or maybe like if you have a skin infection, it's topical, but the idea of burning something is completely foreign.
So I I think there's two main reasons for that. The first is that the majority of what people have been smelling, at least over here in the West or in our market, again, kind of like as
Hmm.
Americans, in recent history, the vast majority of incense that people have had their hands on is usually synthetic, kind of cheap Indian incense. And
Yeah.
I'd say that there's been a lot of synthetics that have been used, especially in Indian incense, but in incense in general, for the better part of the 20th century till present. So the first part of the answer to that question is we don't think of it as medicine because you're not using medical grade materials in burning in making the incense. That's the first reason. Like
Yeah.
you were talking about sage or lavender or something like that. They're not potent medicinals. So that would
Yeah.
be the first reason. And then the second thing is that even in hospitals, I use the word fumigation. When we think about fumigation today, usually you're using some kind of chemical inoculant to kill bugs.
Right. Yeah.
Historically, fumigation just meant that you were burning something. Fumigation, right, through smoke, which is where kind of we get
Yeah.
incense from, or sorry, perfume from perfumum through smoke. And so, as
Okay.
a physician, I would say that your lungs, it's like even in Chinese medicine, your skin is part of your lung system. And
Hmm.
so your lungs are your outside of your intestines are your largest organ to absorb things, either topically or through inhalation. You could
Yep.
also say that the only exposed part of your brain to the outside is in your nose. Kind of like you could say the only bones that are exposed to the outside are your teeth.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't think, but it's like the only part of your brain that's exposed to the outside world is the olfactory bulb in your nose. But
Right.
not just direct contact with your brain and smelling. Even when you inhale these things into your lung, it's still being absorbed. And so, uh, again, I think it ties back also to using medical grade materials, A, and then B, not all materials have the same kind of potency. So, smelling lavender might help calm you down a little bit, but it's not going to whack you in the head like, musk or, quinam or some of these other materials. And so, or even things like ambergris. I mean, ambergris was used in a lot of fumigation materials for like plague.
Right.
So any
I think that
breaks in cities, they'd burn huge chunks of ambergris in the streets.
that's wild.
Ambergris, as much as you and I think of ambergris as something used as fragrance or an incense, its largest use is in
Yeah.
medicine. So it's used prolifically in both Chinese and Unani medicine. So, and Irish as
Uh,
well. And so it's consumed more often than burned or, smelled.
is that consumed for kind of like the mineral calcium kind of element to it? Kind of like a pearl powder or a dragon bone or something like that, or is it something completely
So
different?
dragon bone has more of an anchor, settle, and calm. It has more of like a heaviness. It helps to weigh things down. Uh,
Yeah.
Powder is also kind of the same thing, where it's a heavy material, and so it anchor, settle, calm. With ambergris,
Yeah.
more of a yin and jing nourishing property. So for liver and kidney yin, and usually it's used. Usually, the way I hear people use it today is more for like sex formulas, especially for men. And so you hear,
Of course.
especially in the Arab or Islamic world, I hear people want to use the material because they've got multiple wives. They're trying to keep performance up. So you can use it for that. I would say it helps more with recovery than it does performance because of the
I see. I mean,
nourishing aspect, and it works both for men and women, but it's especially good for men. Yeah,
interesting.
and a lot of the people that I know consume it as a single material. In Chinese medicine, you're almost never using single herbs; they're always being compounded into
Right.
forms. And I think it's much more effective in formulary composition than it is as a single material.
Yeah, that definitely goes for quite a lot of things, I think. But I mean, that's the whole genius of Chinese herbology at the end of the day.
Right.
Yeah, I think the whole conversation about all materials are not created equal, and I mean that's something I definitely have come to so many different times, and the different things that I got into, and it's something I've had to educate, my customers on about different herbal products or teas or supplements, over the last 13 years. And it seems like people are kind of sort of opening their minds up a little bit. But I still think kind of, especially with fragrance, that's still kind of like the dark era for a lot of people. And it's like, oh, it's all just kind of the same, but it's really not like that at all. I
There's
mean,
way more.
which I think is it's like a blessing and a curse because it's like it's a blessing because if you're into it and you get skilled and you get familiar, you can discern differences and access quality. But if you're a newcomer, it can be such a massive disservice because you're like, I got this agar wood and I thought it was good, and then it's like synthetic or it smells like God knows what, or it's diluted, or like it's so many different ways it can go wrong, and then it could be a different. Like there's just a thousand different variables that could make it or break it or whatever, or it could be not for that person's palette or whatever. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the learning curve and the journey with all of this stuff.
So the first thing I'll say to that is, on the front end, it's a curse because there's such a big learning curve. But on the back
Yeah,
end, that's the fun because now there's all these variables in how you can appreciate
yeah,
something. And so, it's like you and I know tea well. I've also kind of alternating here between tea and little scotch. Um, I find it's later in the afternoon over here on the East Coast. Um,
for sure.
the way that I usually try to explain it to people is that coffee, tea, chocolate, whiskey, all of these are great, great analogies, great anagrams for talking about oud, agarwood, and like whatever it is that we're talking about. Because it's like as Americans, the joke is, what kind of wine would you like, red or white?
Exactly.
Anybody who drinks wine is like, oh, sweet Jesus, like, come on. There's so
Yep.
more to it than just red or white.
Hmm.
But then it becomes about the nuance. And so you have to train your tongue a
Yeah.
little bit. And this is where, especially with like tea and whiskey and wine, cheeses, could be another good example because there's this whole spectrum. I mean, okay, it's either,
Right.
or it's fermented milk. Like, yeah, but there's like so much more to it than that. And so on the front end, I think the most important thing is finding reliable vendors. And
Yeah.
it's like I think there's more and more of a cohesiveness out there, so that you don't get stuck dealing with internet BS and people just selling stuff. And I would not only are there people out there that scam you, but there's an awful lot of people that are out there that don't even know what they're talking about, so they don't know they're scamming you.
Right.
They're
Yeah.
selling you something and they don't know it's synthetic. And if you're not here in the United States, tell me if this makes sense. So here, when I'm talking to vendors, producers, supply chain, and I say the word synthetic or artificial, what they hear is
Uh-huh.
that they're talking about Nikes and I'm talking about Jikes. It's not
Ah.
a knockoff brand. The concept
Yeah.
of synthetic and artificial don't compute to a lot of these folks.
I see.
And so they don't, and this is why I said they could be scamming you and not knowing that they're scamming you. They think what they're selling you is real, but it's like a real brand, or it's like from a real company, or this is what everything smells like, so it's real. They don't understand the
Yeah.
difference of like natural, synthetic free, and adulterated. Now it's not true for everybody. I mean, some of these people do know that they're screwing you, but there's an awful lot of them that don't know. And
Yeah.
even with the internet and the connectivity of these things over the last 20 years, a lot of these guys are from countries that, $1,000 is a year's wage. Maybe that's
Yeah.
changing, but certainly, I mean, some of these guys I've worked with in the past, 500 or $1,000 in a year will cover everything for them. And so
Yeah.
they see prices of things online, and because you can source stuff from their home country, they're selling stuff, and they don't even know that what they're selling you isn't the real thing. And so not only was there a consumer learning curve, but there was also a supply chain learning curve. And
Yeah.
I mean, it was a big mess. And then also people, knowingly are scamming people because this looks similar, it smells similar. I'll sell this to you because in pictures online it looks like this. Especially as the Chinese market started to boom. And, big buyers in China didn't even know what they were talking about, let alone people in Southeast Asia that are, selling them junk. So I'd even say it's not just the consumer, like you at the end of your computer, looking online and buying something that has a learning curve. There's been a learning curve for a lot of people in a lot of places all around the world. And so it's really important to find your own supply chain. I mean, people like me, and I'm certainly not the only legitimate person out there. There are other guys out there too.
Right.
And connecting with those folks, that would be the first step. The second step is a little bit like, how you can like recognize someone's sound if you're listening to music. Like you can hear a song and know it's a certain band.
Right.
I would
Right.
say there's a little bit of, because words and scent are a little bit subjective.
A
Start
lot. Yeah.
sampling the work from certain vendors so that you can line up the product with the language that's being used. And even
Yeah.
though there might be similar language between one vendor and another vendor, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily describing things the same way. And so I think there's also
Exactly.
part of the learning curve is sampling vendors so that you can start learning their perspective. It's kind of like learning the sound of the band. Like you have to start learning that so that as you read vendor descriptions, as you talk to people, they can describe something and you can understand what it means. And I can tell you as a vendor, I have customers I ship out to at least 35 countries every year, and I've probably got customers in 50 countries. One of the biggest challenges is most of us are operating through second languages. We also have
Uh,
we also have different cultural and historical perspectives on things. So I have to
yeah.
learn the customer, I have to learn the culture and the perspective that they're coming from, and then try and line that up with, how I think about things. And it can be very challenging sometimes to to align understanding without you having to spend tons of
Yeah.
money to sample products and figure out what we're talking about.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a lot there, especially if we talk about, you know, each region or each culture might have their own kind of palette and what they like, what they don't like, and plus, I mean, people's skin chemistry is a little bit different. So like, I mean, I've had oils that I put them on me and they're just one dimensional. They don't change. They don't really do anything. And I'm all disappointed because it was like a good, expensive oil. Put it on my friend and it's like multi exploding, developing. It's all this other stuff. And I'm just like, what is going on? Like, there's just some type of oils, like for whatever reason, for my skin, like just straight, usually like Krasno oils, just smell like band-aids,
Mm,
just smell like it's just one dimensional band-aid. And I've tried a ton from different regions, whatever, and it just hits my skin and it's just, oh, that's what it is. But then I put that same exact oil on my friends and it's like, oh my God, it's so nuanced. And I'm like, so I don't know, that's just me. I know different cultures, different people, everyone has their thing, but it's another, one of these variables to kind of figure out, what actually works and what you actually like. It's kind of like with the music analogy. Like, I mean, I don't know, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or all these people might be objectively, historically amazing bands, but you subjectively might be like,
eh, right,
little too high pitched for me, you know?
right.
So, I mean, it's just another one of those things, but that's what I kind of like. What I like about what you do and how you present things is it's all very straightforward and transparent. I just kind of like, here's what this is, here's where it's from, here's why I like it, here's how I describe it, and just kind of like let people make their own decision and try it out for themselves. And I think, I mean, for sure for America, you easily have the best selection of sandalwood, agarwood, like all these high grade artisanal things that people can actually sample and try out before, getting full bottles or whatever, which I think is definitely, at least for me, that's when I learn things, I always try to find people that are already like, I kind of look at it like gatekeepers. Like, oh, this person's kind of the gatekeeper to this
Mm.
world where they've traversed the territory. They know where the potholes are. They've found the treasures and the gems. And I can go to them and be like, hi, I'm looking to get to here. And they can be like, oh, for sure, point you in the right direction versus you just dropping into the unknown land yourself and trying to figure it out. I mean, if you have unlimited time and unlimited money, for sure, go for it. But like, not many people do.
It's funny you say that because I get a lot of newcomers that will come to me, and they'll want X, Y, and Z things. Oftentimes, they try to jump right to the top, and
Yeah.
it's not always. It's like your first bottle of scotch should be $1,000. You probably shouldn't buy the strongest blue cheese, to get started. Um,
Yeah.
but they look at prices, and I mean, the stuff is already expensive. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're essentially playing with king shit. Like,
Yeah.
throughout most of history, the irony is that when you look at prices, and as high as they are, they're actually the lowest they've ever been in history, with the widest amount of accessibility to the widest number of
Yep.
people ever. So just
Yeah.
like we were talking about tea, $5,000 to $7,000 a kilo, and now you can buy like great stuff. You spend $100 or $200 on a kilo of tea, and you could be really happy
Yep.
now. So
Yeah.
people come and they think that the price is high and I can do better myself, and so they don't buy from me. I'm going to go direct to the
Exactly.
source, or I'm going to buy from this guy I saw online. And then no kidding. People come back to me 6 months, a year later, 2 years later. They'll have blown 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 grand
Mm-hmm.
in an effort to try and not spend $100.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and by the time they circle back, they've got no more money. And so it's like, well, I mean, I tried to educate you. I tried to, like, I've already gone through this process. I've already, like you said, I found the pit, like, I found all the pits. I've gotten rid of the vipers. I've cleared the path, and then I either
Yep.
curate or create. And so, you
Yep.
were mentioning like here in North America, I would say I have the largest and most diverse offering, not just in North America, but pretty much anywhere on the internet.
Yeah. That's
A lot
true.
of companies, they might have 10 or 15 products at any one point in time.
Yeah.
I've got usually around 250. I mean,
Easily.
currently there's about 60 pure oud oils in the shop. I doubt you'll find somebody
Yep.
with 6.
Yeah, that's true.
I'll have, 8 or 10 or a dozen different sandalwoods. I've got stick incense. I've got woods. And this is just, the attars and everything. And this is just what's
Right.
customer facing. I've got probably
Yeah.
1,500 more items that are available to, the kinds of people who are looking for those things. And that's not in the shop. So, like you said, I try to shortchange that for people. You're not going to do this. You're not
Exactly.
going to do this on a dime. And as expensive as it looks, I'm saving you money, and I'm
Yeah.
saving you heartache, because what happens when you spend $500 or $1,000 or however much money you're spending, and then you never receive anything because they never sent it. They just take your money,
Yeah.
or you think you're ordering one thing and then you get garbage.
Exactly.
So you don't have to deal with any of that, coming from me or people like me. And,
Yep.
we're not just selling product. We're also kind of offering a service. I look at some of the
Mm-hmm.
work that I do kind of as like a concierge service. Maybe it's not quite as intensive as that. But if you call me and you can't find something that's in the shop, I may have it
Yeah.
here. And if I don't have it here, I might be able to get it for you. There's not a lot of
Yep.
businesses that will bend over backwards for you like that.
Yeah, that is true. Especially as something as diverse and like profoundly wide as agarwood or incense or these other things. It kind of reminds me though, as we were talking about America and different markets. So I know you've spent a decent amount of time in Japan. So I'm curious if you can talk about kind of like the experience there for trying to find, like if someone was like, oh, you know what, screw it, I'm just going to go to Japan and I'm going to get my own high grade incense or oils or woods, or I'm going to go to the source and find some quinam for myself. Like, what is that world actually like over there? Since you've actually been there and you know those people, both as a consumer yourself, but also as a retailer.
So I'd say it's a multi-level nightmare. So first off, there are branch companies, there are home offices. They're not all in the same city, nor are they all close to one another. Travel is expensive, and the vast majority of them do not speak English. So, just to give you an example, my wife is actually Japanese. She's over in Japan right now.
Okay.
Her family's in Nagoya. There's an incense company that's in Nagoya. Most people think of Kyoto as being where most of the companies are headquartered, but it's not necessarily that way. But let's say there's 2 or 3 companies in Kyoto that you want to go see. Oh, you
Yeah.
have to know how to get there. You have to take trains, and they're not all right next to each other. And it's like,
Right.
and
Right.
once you get there, the people who are there don't speak English. So unless you have somebody there that speaks Japanese, and they speak English
Mm.
well enough to be able to understand what you're talking about, because all of this wood and incense language is not common language.
That's true, actually. Yeah.
So that also adds a layer of complexity.
Hmm.
I've been fortunate to, the business that I do in Japan, my wife helps me usually with the company in Nagoya. And then I have a guy that I jokingly call second dad, Tanaka.
Okay.
He's an old work colleague of my dad's. He lives in Chiba, which is a suburb of Tokyo. And in the past, in years past, he would usually meet me someplace, and we'd kind of do a week of business, and then I'd usually go back and spend a week with him and his family. He's about to be turning 80, and post-pandemic, he'd
Ah.
get out quite as much. But he was hilarious getting to go talk to these people, because you also have, in Japanese culture, there's still kind of like it's not a class hierarchy, it's like a work hierarchy. And when Tanaka
Yeah.
retired, he was the general manager of Johnson & Johnson Japan, which my understanding is that's actually a higher position than the president of Johnson & Johnson Japan.
Okay.
And on top of that, he's old. And so when we first started going to these incense companies, they would, the two of us together do not look like a pair that would be out and about. And his English is also very good. So finding somebody that's as old as he is that speaks really good English is unusual. You see the
Yeah.
two of us together, and it's like, how did you two get plugged in? And like, why do you think of him as a son? Why does he think of you as a dad? We've been since
Yeah.
I was 5 years old. So, 35, 36 years at this point, we've known each other. He thinks of me as like another son. And, yeah, so it's a multi-layered problem. And even the
Right. Right.
think of this. In order to get the two of us over from Chiba to Nagoya, or not to Nagoya, sorry, to Kyoto, there's at least $500 in train tickets. Then you
Right.
got to get hotels.
Sure.
It's
Sure.
like it costs me thousands of dollars to get this stuff done, and it's taken
Yeah.
me,
Just to even get to the
yeah,
door.
it's taken me years to line it all up. And so, for
Yeah.
somebody to come in and just be like, "Well, I'm going to go do it direct to save a couple bucks," and I'm like, "Good luck."
Right.
And then they call me $10,000 later, and they're like, "I wish I just bought something from you." So
Yeah.
the other challenge is that once you go there, it doesn't mean
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that they just lift the skirt and show you the goods all at once.
Yeah. That's what I was curious about.
Yeah. So the first time I was in Kyoto, I went back. To, I think it was at Yamadamatsu. I went like 5 or 6 days in a row. And I was buying stuff each day, and each day they were showing me different, better stuff. So in order to get to day 6, I had to spend all that money on days 1 through 5. Part of that is, there's very specific language that you have to know to ask for something. That's the first part. So if you don't know the word,
Okay.
how would they ever know to pull it out?
Yeah.
That's the first challenge. So it's like, okay, I bought everything that they thought of. I go back the next day. Well, what haven't you shown me? Okay, more
Yep.
stuff. And then you buy that. Okay, well, what else you got?
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to pull out 50 things to show you from the start. They might pull out 1 or 2 things. Are you interested or not? If the answer is no, that's where it ends.
Yeah.
And then they don't like servicing businesses. They like servicing customers. So also the first time I went there, they were really upset with me because I'm buying a lot of stuff, and they don't have huge amounts of stock of top grade stuff, at least not on hand. And so they would always say, "Don't you want to leave stuff for other people?" They
What a different response
they had no
than
interest
you
in
would think.
selling it. It's like, look, we have 3 pieces. Maybe only buy 1. Only buy 2. Don't take all 3. And they got a little bit upset with me, and I was like, guys, you have to understand, I'm taking this home to my customers. I am not buying this for myself.
Yeah.
Okay? And then the other thing is that, I have to be careful saying this, some of the companies wanted to make sure that I didn't represent Chinese buyers.
Yeah.
Because the Chinese would come in with loads of money, and they would just clean them out if they can. And they're not happy about that
Yep.
either, because they want to be able to make as much material available to their customers as possible. And so,
Yeah.
I had to be my own person. I'm taking this stuff back to America to share with my customers. It's not all going to me. I'm not greedy. This isn't me just coming in and dropping a bunch of money because I care about me and not everybody else. But there were a couple pieces of things that I would buy, and they're like, these are the last pieces of this particular scent profile. We have not seen more. Do not buy it all. As a company, you come to me and I'm like, what would you like to buy? Like, I need to sell stuff. And these guys were like, no, stop. It was kind of comical. It all ended up fine, and we had a good time. And then I'd show up again the next day, and they'd be like, what are you doing here again? Like, well, we got other stuff, I'm sure. Show me something I haven't seen. And these guys, this was my first time doing this with these guys, and it was hilarious.
Yeah, I think that to me is the most fascinating thing. And I think that's something a lot of consumers don't really realize about this stuff, because people like yourself and others have done all the legwork, and it's just an easy transaction, add to cart, click, add, boom, done. Whereas traditionally speaking, historically speaking, culturally speaking, this stuff is like kind of separate from money.
Mm-hmm.
Like money is almost irrelevant for a lot of these things, whether it's what's
I
that?
said it's about relationships. And
Yeah.
you have to take
Well,
time to build those relationships. It's not like, hey, you and me, let's grab a beer. All right, we're instant friends.
yeah, it's also too, I think part of it, their reverence for those substances and their appreciation and value of those substances. They're like, look, we can get more money. That's easy. This stuff, we're not going to get anything more of ever. Like, it's done. And I've experienced that through tea, through different herbs, through like ginseng, through internal arts, so many different things. I remember I went to a tea shop. This Chinese lady owned it, and basically for the first 3 hours I was there, she was just insulting me. Oh, white people don't know shit about tea. All these hippie white guys think they're so whatever, and then she's just like laying it on me for however long, and I had already known. Like, I knew this was the deal, so I was just unfazed and just playing the game and being patient. And she's like slowly doling things out of like, oh, smell this. Oh, what do you think this? And I'm just kind of like, yeah, whatever, it's fine. And then after a few hours, I went to the bathroom. I came back, and she, I guess, just was approved of my character. She saw my intentions were true, and then I actually like valued the thing and had the appreciation for the thing. So she like reached under the counter and was like, here, try this.
Right.
And then was like, I actually have a warehouse down the road, like, come back tomorrow. And so it's like there is that element where I think they want to look, who are you as a person? What's your character? What's your intentions? Can you actually appreciate what this is? Or is it just pearls before swine, or you have money, or some other trivial thing?
Right.
And I think that mindset is really foreign to us, because in America, we're just like, buy it, give us your money, we got to move products, we got debts to pay, we got all this stuff. Whereas there, they're like, nah, we don't need to sell this. Like, are you sure you actually want to buy this? Like, no, I don't think so.
You really know what you're doing? Yeah, it's funny you say that, because one of the best things you can do to kind of cut through that line of bullshit is to bring your own electric heater. Because if you walk in there and you have a really nice electric heater,
yeah, they know.
They sit there, and who else would have this unless they take it seriously? Especially if your heater is
Exactly.
$300 or $500 heater.
Yep.
Like that, you're not playing around with that stuff. And the first time I went to one of these places, I did not have my heater charged. When I
Oh,
went back
okay.
the second day, not only did I have the heater, but I also pulled out a cutting board, a chisel, and a knife. And these guys looked at me like it. I mean, the temperature in there changed immediately,
Yeah.
and the the manager of the place, the second day that I went back in one of these places, he was funny because he had lit a little bowl and had some charcoal, and he was like putting wood chips on there, and I was like, I'm not getting the nuance that I'm looking for, and he was like, okay.
Hmm.
And so then I had him get out. We got out a mica plate, and I essentially made like a Kodo cup, and he's looking at me like, not people be racist right to your face, and it's kind of hilarious. Like it's hard to offend white.
Yeah.
Like, look, I get it. And so then I'm sitting here and I'm like smelling this, and he's looking at me like, I mean, he obviously knows what I'm doing, but how the heck do you know to do it? Next day,
Yeah,
an
exactly.
electric, and I was like, all right, I want you to pull out that wood again. I want you to smell this on my heater.
Uh,
He's sitting there smelling it, and he was like, I mean, he just looked up at me and he was like, okay, I understand what you're talking about now.
so I mean,
Even say
yeah.
as a consumer, sometimes you might know more than the people who are selling to you, even if they are elevated in the company.
Yeah.
And so that's something else to look out for is that, and I would say this is true for talking to vendors, especially as you become an educated consumer, you may talk to
Yeah.
vendors, people online, from all around the world, whoever's trying to sell you stuff. And a lot of times they don't know. They know what they know, and they don't care about all the stuff that they don't know.
Yeah, I think it's also like for us or for people that are enthusiasts of this stuff, it's like it's a passion, it's an obsession, it's something we spend hours every day. And for a lot of these people, it's just like their job or it's commerce or it's just some basic thing or it's a part of their culture that they're like, yeah, whatever, who cares? But for us, it's like this whole other thing. So, but while we're talking about it, it reminds me, if you have any like one story in particular of like maybe some just insane otherworldly Kiara or something that you smelled and kind of like if you've ever had an experience like that where you just had this singular thing that was like this is the top of the mountain, mind blown, but it's like something crazy like that.
Sure. So it's not about Kiara, but it's kind of funny. The punch to this is going to be really funny. So this
Yeah,
this company that's in Nagoya, I had been to a couple times, and my wife, the expression, like no man is a prophet in his hometown. My
yeah,
wife is always why the hell do these people fly in from around the world to meet you? Like, he's not that special.
yeah,
Like, thanks. So we went a couple times to this place in Nagoya, and she was so frustrated with me, like, because we go for hours and I'm talking, and she's having to translate, and to her it was just a big hassle. So I was
yeah.
asking them about a particular type of wood. They had a couple pieces out, and I think if I recall, and this would have been back in 2017, 2018, 2019, something like that. They pull out.
Hmm.
Well, I asked if they had any more of this particular type of wood. And stuff I
Yeah.
think it was like $150 or $200 a gram. Okay, that's gonna be
Okay.
important here in a minute. That means it's like $150,000 or $200,000 a kilo. Okay,
Do you recall where it was from or what the specs were in terms of the region
and I've
or?
I've actually I actually have some pictures on my Instagram, some old pictures of a couple of the pieces. But what's really funny was I asked if they had any more of it, and they had the business that's here, and then there's like an offsite warehouse that they have, but then they have a warehouse that was kind of directly across the street where they kept some stock. And the lady was like, "Well, let me go grab something." She comes back, no kidding, with like a trash bag of this wood in a cart because it was heavy. And I asked her, I was like, "How many kilos are in there?" She's like, "There's at least
Mhm.
15 kilos in there." What's 15 times 150? What's 15 times 200? She pulled out like $2 or $3 million of wood and just walked it across the street for me to look at. That's crazy. I mean, you couldn't pull a suitcase
Yeah.
of cash out like this, but this lady just went and grabbed a suitcase of wood brought it over in a little cart, picks it up. She has me pick it up to put it on top of the counter because it was too heavy. It was like, it was probably 30, 35 pounds.
Jesus.
And I go to pick this thing up, and I'm looking through it, and I'm doing the math in my head, and I look at my wife, and I'm like, "Kay, there's like $2 or $3 million that she just pulled out and put on the counter." You know, my wife is, I get the eye roll. She's like,
So what was the actual experience like smelling that?
So we'll give a little more context here. One of the other things that makes it challenging to find things in places like Japan. You know, if you go to the Middle East, it's Indian, it's Cambodian, it's Sri Lankan. If you try to get specific information like, well, which jungle is it from? Where is it specifically from? You know, what species is it? Like, you don't get any of those details.
Yeah.
It's even worse when you go to Japan because they don't even necessarily tell you the country it's from. Everything is organized by scent profile.
I see.
This is spicy. This is sour. This is, you know, and they might be able to tell you a general region that it's from. Like, oh, okay, this is from Vietnam.
Yeah.
From Thailand. But I would say that it's even not that specific because it's not necessarily from there. And oftentimes, again, you may know more than the person selling it to you, so that they may not necessarily know the details. Even if they're the manager, they may not know because they're not the person who acquired the stuff, or they're not, you know, and then it's categorized by scent. So, okay, they pull out this Vietnamese stuff, but real Vietnamese stuff, they call Shem, not Vietnam. And Shem is the old Champa Empire. So all the names that they have for stuff are generally 5 or 6 centuries old. And the words that they use for them are oftentimes places or meanings that are 5 or 6 centuries old, and there's no longer context for the word. So if they tell you it's from Shem, it can be from parts of Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, southern China, Hainan. So this is Shem smell, okay, and they'll be like, it translates as Vietnam, but if you look up the Shem Empire, it's a much bigger diversity. So here's another example, Kinam. You see today, people say, oh, Kinam's from Vietnam. And this drives me nuts because the Japanese use the word Kiara. So we were talking about how the Japanese will name things, and the names or locations that are used for things are oftentimes 5 or 6 centuries old, and so that context doesn't.
Right.
So what you and I call Kinam, and people call these types of formations Kinam, but the word Kinam is actually a geolocation. So the key in Kinam is the type of wood, like that type of formation is Vietnamese ki, and then the Nam in Kinam is Vietnam.
Yeah.
So the ki in Kiara that the Japanese use is the same ki in Kinam.
Okay.
Now, to a Japanese, Kinam or Kiara comes from Shem. So you'll hear people say, oh, Kinam is from Vietnam, but Japanese would say it's from Shem, which can be Cambodia, Thailand, parts of Cambodia, parts of Thailand, parts of Laos, all of Vietnam, parts of southern China. And then there are other people who will call these key formations from, say, Malaysia or Indonesia or Sri Lanka, and they'll call it Kinam. And it drives me crazy because Kinam is a location. I think it's more accurate to Kiara, but even then, the Japanese concept of Kiara is still the Shem Empire, so it's still kind of a location. Those types of formations do exist in other places, but it starts to get really confusing for people, especially people in the cultures that have old incense traditions, and those words have very specific meanings.
Yeah.
Now, I think over the last couple of years, people have started to realize that these types of formations can be found elsewhere, although they won't be identical to that kind of Vietnam or Chinese scent.
Right.
But this ties back into what I was saying. This is part of the challenge in communicating in Japan. You're using a word to them that has a very narrow definition.
Yeah.
And if you use a word outside of that context, it doesn't make sense. And then if you're trying to ask about something and you don't know the specific word to ask, they don't know what to tell you. That's like saying I need that scotch with the strawberry flavor. Okay, tell me the name of the scotch. Otherwise, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about.
Yeah.
So when I would ask questions, it would get very confusing trying to get like I know what I'm trying to ask for, but then like trying to figure out
Hmm.
how to communicate in a way that would get them to be like, oh, this is what I need to pull out.
Right, right, right.
And I would say, this kind of ties back into your question of what are the experiences of going to Japan and working with these companies. There's
Yeah.
so many language barriers, and it's more than just speaking Japanese or speaking English.
Yeah.
There's a whole kind of tertiary level of language communication here that's more than just Japanese or English.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially because, things like agarwood, kiara, kinam, even tea, even other things, almost kind of has its own language within a language, its own vernacular, its own all these other words. And what you're saying with Japanese language, it's using terms that are 500, 600 years old. And then it's like there's just so many layers of communication just dropping off that it seems like it obviously creates like a massive challenge. And I remember a buddy of mine, his wife is also Japanese. She was born and raised there, and he's really into tea. So he'll go there. But like his wife doesn't know anything about tea. So he'll try to tell her things, but she's like, yeah, I don't know how to say that. I don't know how to, I don't even know how to ask that. So they just don't even bother anymore. They just like, yeah, okay, whatever, drink whatever basic stuff. Cause it's like, can be so nuanced and have its own language.
Well, I'm relenting. I'm entirely willing to drive my wife nuts as I try to find out things. Tanaka, on the other hand, when he helps me, this is all a game to him because it doesn't mean
Yeah.
anything to him. He's retired. He does not give a crap if we win or not. He wants to win because it helps
Right.
me. But if we can't figure
Sure,
something
sure.
out, it's no skin off his nose. But he also doesn't mind putting in the effort and sitting there with me for hours and hours and hours to
Right.
grill these guys to get to
Yeah.
what we're going. And most of the time, he'll be laughing with them at me because who is this white guy that's come in here asking these like why is he so intense? How does he know to ask these things? Who the heck is he
Yep.
working with that he would even need to get this specific? For them to be
Hmm.
so. He's laughing at me. They're laughing at me. They're laughing together at me.
Yep.
And I love it. It's like I said, it kind of becomes a big game.
Yeah.
Just
I mean, it's definitely an adventure.
yeah. I mean, I get the same thing too going in the Middle East. Where I'm asking questions and they just most of the time they don't have the specificity. The Japanese have the
Hmm.
specificity, but you don't have the language.
Yeah.
There's Arabic in the Middle East. There's kind of like Arabic specificity about certain things, but the words don't translate into English, and you have to know the specific
Right.
word. And sometimes
Hmm.
the word that they use is Arabic, and sometimes the word that they use is the word from whichever country of origin it's from.
Yeah.
So if you're asking for, think of something Salah, and it's like a particular type of formation. So this is true in Asia too. There might be not only are there words for the origin that it's from, but then there's the word for the particular type of formation.
Yeah.
So that also can get really confusing because maybe you're looking for a very specific type of agarwood from a very specific location. You go
Right.
to the Middle East, they might know the word for the specific type of formation, but then it's like, well, it's Cambodian. It's Hindi. And Hindi can mean
Yeah.
really India or Bangladesh, and it's not specific to any one area. It can mean pretty much the entire subcontinent. So it's not very specific, and sometimes they could be like, oh, well, it's from Nagaland. Okay, well, where in Nagaland is it from? I don't know. So it's like you're limited sometimes in how specific you can get about things, in terms of geolocation. And I'm sure you've noticed, anybody who looks through my shop, I try to be really specific. I give really
Hmm.
specific geolocations when I have that information. And
Yeah.
and even I don't always have that information because the resource I'm getting something from has to know in order for me to know. So
I feel like what we can take away from from all of this is just that at every single step of the journey of sourcing agar wood, buying it, using it, it's just kind of a pain in the ass, but in the most amazing way. Like there's so many ways it can go wrong or be lost in translation, and it's just a real pain in the ass. But it can be so rewarding and so worth it and so fulfilling. But for people who have that mindset or character that enjoys it, it can also be an adventure, kind of a quest, which can be very expensive at times, but can also be incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, that's why.
So it reminds me.
Oh no, you said it reminds you.
Well, I wanted to ask, just kind of like for all the obsessive like frag head addicts, just if you have like a story of just an experience of smelling a wood or something in either in the Middle East or in Japan that just absolutely like rocked your world.
So, yeah, there's two things I'll say to that, and then we'll have a story. The first is that remember how I was saying like drinking wine, eating cheese, drinking scotch, you have to develop a palate.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
the first thing is until you've started to develop your palate, sometimes you can try
Hmm.
something and the magic
Yeah.
totally goes over your head.
100%. Yeah.
So there are things that I got from the very beginning of my journey that I was kind of like, okay, that's nice. That I'll come back to
Hmm.
years later and be like,
Yeah.
it's like, how did I not realize that I have what I have?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Did you freeze up again or something? Looks frozen.
All right, come back.
Maybe he'll come back. We'll see.
It froze. All right, are we back? It froze there.
Okay. Yeah. Looks like you're back.
So it's like, how did I not know that I have something? So
Hmm.
there's a piece of wood that I gave Tanaka right when I was beginning all of this stuff.
Okay.
And uh, so when I started getting into all this stuff, I've been listening to Incense for ages, but really when I started the company and I started really diving deep, and I started enlisting Tanaka's help, um, his big thing was, at my age, I've grown up around this stuff, and it's really funny that my white American son is teaching me about my own culture.
Yeah.
And which he was tickled to death about. And then he tells me that the biggest regret he has in life is having grown up around all of this stuff and known none of it. So he always talks about it as I'm so thankful to have it, and I wasted most of my life because I could have been enjoying this the entire time.
Hmm.
So in the beginning, I had bought a batch of Vietnamese wood that I didn't pay a whole lot for it, and I picked out the nicest piece from the batch, and it was one of the first
Hmm.
things that I gave to Tanaka. Turns out I gave him a big old piece of Kiara. Somebody sold me a bunch of Keenum for cheap because they didn't know what they had either.
It's right as you're beginning too. That's
Right in
incredible.
the beginning. And
Yeah.
and then after, it's like and I sold the stuff too because I didn't quite realize what I had. But I gave him this really nice big piece that was really nice Keenum that I had no idea, and he still has it and he still enjoys it. I mean, it's not like I asked for it back or anything, but
Right.
that's one of those personal things where even me, kind of at the beginning, I didn't. Not only did I get something from somebody that they didn't know that they had, but here I am getting
Yeah.
it, not realizing just how special what I'd gotten was, and then here I am,
Right. Right.
essentially giving it away to people.
Hmm.
So go figure. It wasn't like sinking grade fully resonated, but it's definitely Keenum. I mean, it's absolutely what it is, and it's still very good quality stuff.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I got a couple 100 grams of it, and I pretty much sold most of it. Gave him a big piece, and yeah, that was pretty horrifying when I realized what happened. Um,
I mean, I think it's a great story though.
yeah, I would say in general, like I said, on the front end, because you don't know what you don't know, you can't pick up on all the nuance.
Right.
And I remember, um, oh gosh, what's his name? Uh, he's a perfumer. he's got a place in Roja Dove,
Yeah.
you know,
Okay.
and it's like most of what he's selling is synthetic. He's still selling really good quality, high grade stuff. But I
Mm-hmm.
remember I was listening to him giving a talk about jasmine, and
Mm-hmm.
he was talking about grass jasmine as opposed to Indian jasmine, and he's talking about differences in quality and price, and then trying to evaluate the value of something. And
Right.
so he
Right.
was saying, you could get the best quality, just the absolute best quality Indian jasmine, nicest batch you've ever smelled. And
Mm-hmm.
he's like, and then you compare it to a batch of grass jasmine, and he likes grass jasmine better. He says maybe you could say it's anywhere from 1.2 to 2 times better than the best Indian jasmine you get, but it's
Mm-hmm.
18 times the price. He's
Right.
like, so you have a factor of 18 up against a factor of maybe zero point 0.2, or twice as good. And he says this
Right.
is this is where nuance gets important, and if you
Absolutely.
can't sense nuance, the value's not there. But if you can
Right.
sense nuance, incremental changes and incremental improvements can have massive impact on price and value.
100%.
and
Yeah.
and and that that comment always stuck with me, because I'd say the same is true with tea. It's like you can have a really
100%. Yep.
really nice batch of tea, and then you can have another incrementally better batch of tea that's like 5 or 10 times the price.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to ask, is it worth the price? And if it is, you'll pay anything for it, for that nuance.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was something as I got into higher quality teas that it's the same across the board, no matter what the consumable is. The higher up you go, the differences and the subtleties get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Whereas at the bottom, it's like the differences can be massive and like super obvious and gross. But then the further up you get, it's kind of counterintuitive. It kind of gets a lot more subtle and a lot more refined and a lot more gentle, so which that's true for a lot of things. And I think, especially as people get into things and they're new, like there's this weird element of timing for
Mm-hmm.
things, where it's like you might have a tea or an herb or an oil or an incense, and on day one you're kind of like, I don't really know about this, like, not really working for me. But then something changes, your nose, like for example, I remember when I first, some of the first like high grade incense I bought was from you. I got a Vietnamese one, and I think a Hainan.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you absolutely, for the first year, it just smelled like burnt wood. I would light the incense, and was just like, it just smells like wood's burning. So I left it alone because I was like, well, I'm not gonna just waste this. And then all of a sudden one day, I burned it, and I was like, what? What is this? Like, just all these things, but it was like, I don't know what it was. I don't know what that variable was, but it was just like something over time flipped, and it went from just like burnt wood campfire to insanely deep, nuanced, resinous, all these other things. But the substance didn't change. It was just my perception and my whatever. I don't know what that exact variable is.
You develop,
So I just, what's
you
that?
said you developed that palate.
Yeah, somehow. I mean, just through repetition or whatever. So I think it's just an important point for if people are new, and even sometimes for people that are more experienced. Like, I mean, I've been doing oils for like 5 years, and I have stuff that I put on, and I'm like, damn, this is hitting hard. Like, I never noticed all this stuff before, but it's just like my system changed.
Right.
So I think that's one thing I tried to tell people, because it's also a relevant idea for health. Don't do what the obvious thing is, which is seek more stimulation, seek more amounts, and seek more and more of things. Actually learn to just chill out, relax, and develop subtlety and actually develop nuance and kind of go in that direction. And then you actually get way, way more out of way, way less. Because it's like, yeah, on the front end, oils, incense, woods, whatever can be expensive, but like a gram of high quality wood can last years. Like, because you can get so much from a tiny little speck, or even oil, like the tiniest dot can yield. I mean, that's like maybe 8 hours of aroma right there. So it's like,
I
so I think that,
I was just going to say, I find on the front end the price tag looks high, but then if you're using this stuff appropriately, the way that you and I would use these things, because you can stretch out so many uses.
yeah,
Let's say I buy a bottle of $500 oil, okay, a 3 gram bottle of oil. That some people, because they have a real heavy application, they go through it real quick. Let's say I get 200 applications out of it. Well, how many times does 200 go into 500? That means each
right,
application is $2.50.
right,
I'll give another perfect example. My wife being Japanese, this is going to be a story about rice. The price of, you can spend a lot of money on rice over in Japan, hands down. But it is less expensive there than it is here. Things have to be imported and sold and distributed. And so we were talking
right,
with a Japanese coworker of hers who's a little bit older than us, and the two girls are bitching and moaning about how expensive the rice is. And I said, well, her name's Emiko. I said, Emiko, how much rice do you guys like? How long does it take you to use a bag? She says, oh, we go through about a bag a month. I said, okay. Are you eating rice at every meal? Yeah. So the bag was $30. They're eating 3 meals of rice a day over 30 days. I said, Emiko, you're eating $1
right,
of rice a day. It's 30 cents a meal, and you're feeding 4 people.
right.
And she just stops for a second, and she says, I hadn't thought of it that way. I guess rice is really pretty cheap. Just because it was more expensive here than it was in Japan. You can look at
Right.
these things and be like, wow, I spent $200 on a tube of incense. But, but then you're burning on it for like an entire year. You could spend a couple $100
It's
on a
not.
bottle of oil, but, it takes you 5 years to get through it.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm sitting here drinking, a little bit of scotch. I could spend $200 on a bottle of scotch. There's 25 ounces in a bottle of scotch. If you're having a 1 ounce pour, that's 25 portions. So
Right.
25 portions out of a $200 bottle is $4 a glass. $8 a glass. Okay.
Right.
Now, let's say I'm drinking a $35 bottle of wine, and you get 4 glasses out of a bottle of wine. Well, first off, that
Same
bottle of
price.
scotch might take me a year to drink through. A bottle of wine you
Right.
drink in one night, and if it's $35, how much is each glass when there's 4 of them? You
Exactly.
paid more money for a portion of a bottle of wine that's, a fraction of the cost. And so as you start getting these expensive things, because all you need is a little dot on your hand or on your chin, and you can, put your hands over your nose and breathe these things in, not to mention it's impacting you all day because you're breathing through it. It's fumigated, right? It's like inhaling medicine with every breath. You can buy really expensive stuff, and it really, per session, per use, and it's not like you put a dot and it's gone. It's there all day.
Yeah, exactly.
It really becomes feasible and affordable. And then, like I said, we're playing with king shit.
100%.
It's the most accessible, least expensive it has been in all of history, and it's all at your fingertips. You can hop online, hop into one of our shops, buy the stuff. It's there in a couple of days. Whereas in the past, it's kings and emperors, and the amount of effort that they would go through to get this stuff. I mean, when you go to Japan, they have all these stories about some general or some king. Like there's this one story about a general a couple hundred years ago who had a nicer agarwood collection than the emperor, and that was a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, and he had 135 pieces of wood.
Whoa.
Arguably, you can have 135 pieces. Maybe one piece is as big as your finger. Yep, you're falling here. Sorry about that. One piece as big as your finger. You could have, pieces the size of your arm or your leg or whatever it is, but I don't think he
Right.
huge pieces. Well, I've got over 150 batches of wood here. So I
Yeah,
have more.
easily.
I have more than a general who was a threat to the emperor because he has more agarwood. I mean, like, and I don't have the resources that some imperial general would have had in Imperial Japan.
Right.
And you have access to all of those, whereas nobody would have had access to this guy's collection.
Yeah, I feel like that we've kind of covered that idea from a lot of different angles. Just really, hopefully, people understand and it drives home just the importance and the power of these substances and kind of how lucky we are right now to be able to access them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think hopefully, I think what people should really try to do and what I try to do personally is develop myself to be able to actually appreciate and get the most out of this thing that at a certain point in time will probably not exist on the planet. I mean, Kiara Kinom is a finite resource. Eventually, that's it. And even with some of the higher grade agar wood stuff and some of the aroma profiles, like there's not more. It's not a commercial good in the traditional way that we're used to thinking about these things. So I think it's really important to have that intention when we're using those things, and basically trying to source them for ourselves. So I think just to wrap things up, how could people learn more about what you're doing, reach you, contact you, and go a little bit deeper into a lot of the stuff we talked about today?
So currently I operate off of Etsy. You can find me under Rising Phoenix Perfume under Etsy. If you're on Instagram, it's the Rising Phoenix Perfumery. If you would like to join the Rising Phoenix fan club, I laugh at myself as I say that. We do have a Rising Phoenix fan page that's on Facebook. Be sure to answer the questions just so I can real easily just hit accept to get you in there. But I'd say Instagram and Etsy are probably where we're most active. And you can find us. I'm not sure if you're familiar with UDICT, but UDICT is an association that I'm a part of reliable vendors. And so it's not just me, there's other guys there. We'll give a plug to them too. I think with a lot of vendors as well, like you said, it's a big world. I think there's room for all of us. And as artisans, I think it's important to encourage one another. It's not all about hoarding everything for myself. Just like musicians, you listen to other people's music to inspire your own instead of hoarding that music for yourself. I'm happy to give those guys a plug too over on UDICT. But yeah, Etsy, the Rising Phoenix Perfume, on Instagram, Rising Phoenix Perfumery. If you do a Google search for J.K. Delap, Rising Phoenix, you'll probably get 10 pages of hits of interviews and other things about work I've been doing. How about you? Where can we find you?
HyperionTV.com, HyperionHerbs.com. And I'll post links for everything below, whatever platform you're consuming this, there'll be links. And I definitely highly recommend people checking out your Etsy store, because I think what's cool about it is you have stuff for maybe people that have the budget and have the experience. You have the top end, really crazy, expensive, rare shit. But then if people are just kind of getting started and they don't necessarily want to drop $500, whatever, you have a whole line of kind of like more. You have a bunch of cultivated oils and more kind of budget friendly just to get started kind of things. So that's what I like is like a range, and it's all super accessible.
The nice thing is even the inexpensive stuff, I would say, is they're exceptional specimens for the price. Yeah. I have people who buy stuff from me that they buy stuff from people all over the world, and they'll usually tell me that you're not going to find much of a better value, let alone under one.
Yeah.
Especially at some of the price points that I have for the products. So thanks for noticing. I appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure, man. I mean, it's especially even the sandalwood. I cannot think of another place that I've ever seen that has the array of like completely unique artisanal sandalwoods. I mean, I have the one that I got from you that it's like destroys every other sandalwood that I've ever smelled. I can't remember the exact name that you called it.
Baoshan Manco.
Oh no, I'm talking about the oil.
Oh, the oil. Got a lot.
Yeah, it was the one that was made from, I think, Indonesian statue and bead scraps, like sinking grade.
So is that the Sumba Imperial?
I think it might have been that one.
Probably one of my
that's
Imperial series then from Indonesia.
Yeah, that one was insane. I mean, I have half the bottle left, but it's like, just smelling it, I'm like, this has to be an attar or a perfume, because it's like so layered, and it's almost like thick and potent like an oud oil, which sandalwoods usually aren't. Which is why I've never really been that big on sandalwood, because it's always just been kind of like one-dimensional or thin or watery. But this is like So that's just what I mean. That's why I definitely recommend people check it out. And again, there'll be links below. So again, I appreciate you, taking the time and coming on, and for kind of covered a lot of ground. And I hope people will have a lot more of a context for these things in terms of the history and the culture and the applications for medicine or for incense, and now for us, just kind of enjoyment. And also, most importantly, like developing the appreciation, and I say the reverence and the respect for the substances, and like how lucky we are to be able to access it, like living king's lives, like you were saying, or accessing king shit.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely, people want to learn more. I definitely recommend checking out the links below, and thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for having us, guys.